understand, and then that will help us easily transition into Wapanda and what Tom is doing, because ultimately what I'm hoping to give everyone as before they leave here is a sense that NFTs are really, really important, and they're really important to help solve real world problems and look at things in a way that's different than just postage stamp cartoons that are worth something to somebody at some time. So let me start with the background of what is Algorand, the Algorand 101 story, if you will. So I assume that everyone in this room more or less understands that blockchain is really a technology that's built on cryptographic proofs, which means that if it's built on cryptographic proofs, you better have somebody who really understands cryptography. And the foremost mind behind cryptography in today's modern age is a guy named Silvio Micali, MIT professor, Turing Award winner, which is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in computer science. And he's the guy who founded Algorand. So Silvio, his brain actually thought of everything that you see going on in the things like Bitcoin and Ethereum before Bitcoin and Ethereum ever existed. The technologies there just wasn't there. And when those were developed, he was blown away by them. He thought they were awesome. And they're still awesome, for that matter. But they also had some fatal flaws in them, and it bothered him greatly. He did not want to sit back and accept that you couldn't be both, that you couldn't have solves for decentralization, scalability, and security. He wouldn't accept it. So with the DARPA grant in hand and his MIT students, they set out to disprove it. And running different computer models and simulations, they did disprove it. And they wrote a white paper around it. That white paper, lo and behold, was called Algorand. That became the Algorand company when some very smart venture capital money came in behind it. And lo and behold, you had the start of Algorand. What's the difference between Algorand and the other aforementioned blockchains? It's proof of stake as opposed to proof of work. For those of you who aren't familiar, proof of work is where you get the term mining from. Basically, you're always trying to validate the transactions that are occurring on chain. So if Ron is trying to send me money, which I would like to send over to Tom, there's some type of cryptographic equation going on there that's allowing that to occur. And someone's got to prove that that's real. He exists, I exist, he exists, the transaction's real, what's going across the wires is actual, and that's all happening cryptographically. And so in a proof of work, what happens is someone's trying to race to prove that. In order to do it, you run massive computer modeling capabilities to do that. And that's what proof of work does, and whoever wins that puzzle solved quickest and most complete ends up winning the Bitcoin or the Ether, and that's why they mine for it, just like you mine for gold. The problem with that is it takes computers the size of this room to run it, and energy that is enormous to do it. Proof of stake, however, which is what Algorand is built upon, doesn't validate that way. It's validated by something called a random verification functioning, which is self-created by Silvio. He wrote the papers and all around zero knowledge proofs, which for those of you guys who are in or gals who are in the world of blockchain understand what ZKs mean, but it's the baseline of everything that all the blockchains have to thank for it. So at some level, we all have Silvio and what he and Sherry Goldwasser developed to thank for what we all sit here and do. So let me give you some of the pluses to Algorand and why it's been so well received. Algorand's incredibly fast. It's also incredibly secure. It's also incredibly cheap. That sounds like a pretty good combination. Well, in blockchain, it's built on the premises, all blockchains, that at some level, the way that you get trust into the system, which is the key to making blockchain successful, is by creating decentralization. Why do those two things go together? Because if you're in a room where you can control a couple of people's thoughts, it's very easy to attack that thought. But if you're completely decentralized, it's very difficult for that to occur. And when you can't control a group of thought, you by definition, it seems backwards, but by definition, you create trust in that system because no one person can dominate the conversation, unlike right now. So right now, we're in a centralized interview, you can see. And so while we would strive to have perfect decentralization, reality is you're probably never going to really get to perfect decentralization. But Algorand was built with that concept in mind, to try and create that as much as possible. And so why does proof of stake do that? Well, you may have heard of something called delegated proof of stakes or bonded proof of stakes. Well, Algorand runs on something called pure proof of stake. And let me explain the difference of that and why it works. So in the case of proof of work that we talked about before, bigger machines, faster machines, they can control more of the validation process. It forces centralization. Just having sheer numbers doesn't make something decentralized. In fact, up until recently, all of the the mining power was all located in like 3 different hubs around the world. So let's just put that off to the side. Now let's go to bonded proof of stake or delegated proof of stake. In both of those circumstances, he who has the most money can prove out as the validators above anyone else, or he who has the most stake can prove out the validation before anybody else. Again, it becomes very attackable because you know where the decisions are being made. But in a pure proof of stake, it's quite the opposite. Nobody knows who the other validators are at any time. There is a large randomly selected pool, and from that pool, which is randomly selected, another random selection process through a second verification random process occurs, and those people become the validators. And so there's never a point of attack where that can occur. That creates incredible security. More importantly, as a system grows and grows and grows and grows and grows, there's more and more and more and more validators. And that creates more and more and more and more decentralization, as opposed to the previous example I gave you, where if you have 10 people in a world of 100, and now you have 10 people in a world of 1,000, and those same 10 people in a world of 10,000, you've actually created greater and greater and greater and greater centralization. That's bad for any blockchain, because you're creating a stronger point of attack. When you end up with pure decentralization, again, theoretically, you've created a trustless chain. If you have trustless chains, and this is really important, you then achieve the one thing that all high finance is trying to achieve. They're always trying to get to a point where there's complete risk aversion. Well, the way to create complete risk aversion is by having something to be as far on that end of the trustless spectrum as possible, because then you know there's no risk of any type of attack or other way to falsify a transaction. So Algorand's managed to achieve that. It solved the quote-unquote trilemma of decentralization, security, and speed. It also was able to, because it doesn't take these large computers to run it, it runs incredibly efficiently. It runs as a not only carbon neutral, but a carbon negative blockchain. The amount of energy it takes to run a node on Algorand could be done on a Raspberry Pi. For those of you who don't know what a Raspberry Pi is, think about your cell phone in your hand right now and take about 1/10 of the power of that thing has. That's a Raspberry Pi. That's literally what you could run Algorand on. Contrast that with the fact that the entire protocol of Algorand, which would be maybe 10 houses in and around this area, versus the entire country of Singapore to run Ethereum. That's the difference in energy consumption that we're talking about. It's massive, and it's a big problem for the world. The world cares about this kind of stuff. As much as Ethereum, as an example, talks about converting to 2.0 to be on proof of stake for all the other reasons, for cost and so forth, that's a big thing, and I give the Ethereum community a lot of credit for wanting to do this. They want to be ESG compliant, if you will. Everybody does. If you don't think it's important, go check out the biggest asset managers in the world. I mean the biggest. And check out what their current investment guidelines say about how they have to invest in ESG compliant companies. You'll be blown away. BlackRock, which has $13 trillion, I believe it is, under management, has committed that by 2030 they will not invest in one company that is not carbon neutral. Think about what that means for the world as we know it from high finance. So Algorand, when it was built with all these things in mind so that it could handle all sorts of enterprise level transaction volume. Does the world need it right now? Maybe not to the same degree that it will in 5 years, but it's going to happen. So we can run at 1,200 transactions per second. We can populate a block in under 4.5 seconds. We can move that to 10,000 and will very shortly, transactions per second. It'll go to 50,000 in under a year's time. At the same time, we reduce blocks to 2.5 seconds. Why is that important? Because then it puts you on the same scale as something like Swift, which is a bad, broken system in and of itself. But just think about the power that that brings to being able to handle transaction volume in the real financial world. We'll get to NFTs in a moment, I promise. Also, when Algorand transactions, we say we do 1,200 transactions per second, those are final transactions. That's not just somebody beeping up to a node and saying that they had a transaction. And there's plenty of blockchains that'll quote much higher numbers. Oh, we can do 100,000 transactions per second. No, you can't. You can throw something up to a node 100,000 times per second, but they're not final transactions. Every transaction on Algorand is quoted as a final transaction. Those are things that are happening. It's a round trip. It's me sending it to him and closing. That's a final transaction. Algorand has also been proven to, statistically and by third-party verification, it can never fork. Unless it was chosen to fork, it cannot fork. But why is that important? Well, imagine, as thinking about NFTs, if you had a circumstance where he thinks he owns a Mona Lisa, I think I own the Mona Lisa, and you think you own the Mona Lisa, because our chain forked, because 3 different people raced to solve the problem. We all solved it at the same time, and those 3 chains go off. Eventually, 2 of them are going to die, and 1 of them is going to continue. Well, that's great for the one that continued. Really, really bad for the guy who spent $100 million on the other 2 chains. Not very, very, very good. Algorand's also never had 1 second of downtime. Now that may not sound like a big thing, but just consider, you're sitting there, Citibank, you're sending trillions of dollars across the world, and you go down for a day at a time, 2 days at a time, 3 days at a time. How the hell do you run a business that way? Let alone a major financial institution. Not possible. These are all the types of things that we strive to make sure happen on Algorand. Now, Algorand isn't a name that comes to a lot of people's minds when they first say blockchain, and it's because we're not massive marketers. You'll see a lot more of it because we're now so heavily involved in NFTs and the DeFi community, and to some degree kind of catching up with some of the others that have done a better job marketing themselves. So just stay tuned and you'll keep seeing more and more and more and more of it, which we love. We also have a fully developed developer relations team. It's a real company, Algorand. It's not like you can't go 1-800-Ethereum or find somebody to talk to. Algorand's got 100 people sitting there ready to answer questions and all, in addition to all the different social media channels that I'm sure you guys are all comfortable and use all the time. And so as we've now moved into the more retail-oriented, friendly spaces, most of that because of the demand that came from folks that were already building things on some of the other chains but wanted a more stable, secure, and cheaper alternative, it's by definition that we've become so maniacally focused on not only the DeFi world but the NFT space. So let me take 5 minutes here, 3 minutes anyway, to talk about NFTs, which will then lead into Tom's conversation. When I say NFTs, most people's first thought goes to one of 2 things. Beeples, or some kind of fun-looking cartoon that's about this big, and it's a simian of some sort that has a different crown, a different colored jacket, blows smoke out of a different orifice, and apparently if you blow smoke out of an ear as opposed to a butt, it's more rare than the other one, whatever it is. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's great. Who am I to say why that painting up there or that painting up there is worth anything? I don't know. It appeals to somebody, and so it's worth it. If this glass of water is purchasable by Didi for $1, that's worth $1. If he wants to buy it for $120 million, that's worth $120 million. I'm all for it. But that does not define what an NFT is. An NFT, what it really is not the asset itself. An NFT is the tokenization of the identification of any asset. That can be a digital asset, that could be a hard asset. Once you understand that, you understand the true power of what NFTs really are. Once you can assign that form of identification that lives with an asset forever, for perpetuity, you then realize what it can do for you and what you can attach to it as well going forward. So what we've seen over the last 8 months is not so much the retail end of the NFT spectrum, which we all hear about and see. And as I said before, my grandmother now knows what an NFT is. Jesus, they talk about it on the Today Show and Jimmy Fallon and on SportsCenter, for that matter. They're talking about all the stuff that is that kind of great, fun cartoon kind of jazz. And that's awesome. What they don't realize is that it's become so well sought after by large enterprise, large corporations who've gotten the realization that this is a way for us to connect with our clients. This is a way for us to connect with our customer base. This is a way for us to create an experiential happening that we can now make our offerings not only more valuable, but make our clients more sticky. And it's become a branding, a licensing, and a marketing tool for these large corporations. It's the same thing for individuals like artists and songwriters and athletes for that matter. They want ways to connect with their fan bases that's different than just simply offering up a great picture of me slamming, if I'm LeBron James, over Rudy Gobert's head. It's cool, and it might sell for a lot of money, but they actually want to give back more than that and create some type of connectivity to their clientele or their fan bases in this example. And that's what NFTs have now allowed to happen. The other thing to understand that NFTs are not all about just sports, music, and entertainment type of happenings. NFTs really represent real world assets. You can take real estate and you can fractionalize ownership in real estate and now make a piece of property in Detroit, Michigan, purchasable by somebody sitting in Kowloon, Hong Kong. That's fascinating. And it can happen like that securely. I mean, just think of the power that's associated with that. That's all happening because of this creation of NFTs. And when you start to put all those things together, you start to realize that there's real world applications for things like NFTs and tokens in general. And they can solve real world problems. So one of the reasons I wanted to make sure that we had Tom here tonight is because what Wapanda is doing is really cool. They're taking a look at something that we've all, I guarantee everyone in this room has at one time or another been in a cab or a taxi or an Uber or a Lyft or a Via. And there's problems with certain elements of that, which Tom's about to talk to, and it's using blockchain technology and NFTs that's going to help solve some of these problems, not just for the user and the rider, but for the governmental entities that have been trying to make these companies compliant, make it safer for everybody, and put regulation that works for everybody around it in a way that it's functional. So I'm going to sort of back off because I'm over talking, I know at this point, pass it over to Tom to give you a bit more of an understanding about what Wapanda does and how this whole concept of the technology around NFTs is really lending itself to real world problems and solutions for those problems. Obviously available to answer any questions. Feel free to raise your hand if something comes up. Otherwise, we can talk about it after the fact. Okay? So Tom, over to you.
You sure? I could listen to you all night, Barry. No? Okay. Well, first of all, thanks from me as well to Didi and Revka and Ron for inviting us, and thanks, Barry, for including me as well. I'll give you a very quick quick background of myself, and then I'll talk about the NFT issue, which Barry teased so capably. So as Barry said, we go back a long way. We both started on Wall Street. We both got 30 plus careers on Wall Street behind us. I worked at Merrill with Barry. I worked at Deutsche Bank, and I worked at JP Morgan. In the sort of maybe 12, 13 years ago, I started feeling like the learning curve was getting a little flat. I still was working in kind of institutional capital markets. I'd actually gone to a fund manager at that point, a company called Magnetar Capital. And I got very active in angel investing. I've got about, 25 different angel investments at this point, and it's kind of all over the place. But I found myself really excited and really interested in innovation and new technologies and new business models. And I was never really a blockchain guy, but I have kind of had a couple near misses on blockchain. One of them, this unfortunately wasn't a total near miss. It was something I did. I was an investor in a company called Monograph. I don't know if anybody's heard of a company called Monograph. Monograph was basically the first NFT platform. It was founded by a guy here in Brooklyn, Kevin McCoy. He's a digital arts professor at NYU who had the idea of, well, why don't I register? I'm making digital art. Why don't I register ownership on the Bitcoin blockchain? So you could do a Bitcoin transaction and you could register the ownership of that digital asset on the Bitcoin blockchain. And it was a great idea, really cool. Got a lot of visibility for a very short amount of time, and then the business kind of folded up. Now, Kevin, fortunately, when NFTs came back around, he went deep into the bowels of Amazon Web Services and found that first NFT that he had done on Monograph and unearthed it and NFT'd it for real this time. He made $1.5 million. So he did fine. He fortunately made out okay on the very first NFT. But other than that, and the fact that I have a son who's an active computer graphics artist who is very, very much in the middle of the NFT world these days. Everybody in his cohort is one way or another dabbling in NFTs. I haven't really been involved in blockchain, but I certainly watch it with a high level of interest from a distance. And a couple things ended up converging when I ended up joining Wapanda. So the story of my joining Wapanda was I was at this fund management company called Magnetar up in the sort of the late 2010s. And a couple guys came in to our office and said, we think that New York City taxi medallions are a really interesting investment. We kind of laughed a little bit. And but we listened to their story, we thought it was interesting, and at that point, taxi medallions had gone. There was effectively a bubble, sort of like the real estate bubble of the 2008 financial crisis. Just as that market bubbled and burst, the same thing happened to taxi medallions. Medallions were being bought by new taxi drivers, by immigrants who had just come into the taxi business, and they paid ridiculous prices. I think the high print on medallions was in the early 2010s, and it was $1.3 million for a single medallion. Medallions, as of probably the end of last year, after the entrance of Uber, after the entrance of Lyft, after COVID, were trading around $75,000. So more than 90% from the highs, and it's caused a lot of financial anxiety. It's caused a lot of personal anxiety. It's been a personal tragedy for a lot of people. The city's actually done some things recently to make that market kind of remedy some elements of that market, and that's to some extent being worked out. But at that point, medallions were a disaster. And the guys were interesting. I kind of stayed in touch, passed on the investment. They came back a year later, had another nice conversation, passed again. And then in 2020, they came back and mentioned, well, we're still interested, and we've gotten an investment from Bradley Tusk. I don't know if you know who Bradley Tusk is, but Bradley Tusk is a venture capitalist, and he's a government relations consultant, government advisory consultant that works with startups significantly and some big companies. And he was effectively, he had a political career for many years, and he became the chief regulatory advisor to Uber in the early 2010s. And he managed to get Uber into every major city around the world and made the company very valuable and made himself quite rich. So he had made the decision to himself, both as a consultant and as an investor, get behind Wapanda, because his view was that taxis are actually due for a turnaround for a couple different reasons. One is the medallion market is just too cheap. Even if the taxi business is a disaster, medallions still have some value. But more importantly, it's the regulated aspect of taxis that's going to be very important as new mobility technology is adopted in cities. Cities are not going to let what happened with Uber happen again. They're not going to let somebody just come in with a new technology, run around unregulated. Even though Uber and Lyft have done great things for the mobility market, I'm a user and a customer myself, and I think most people who have used the service view it as a major improvement over what taxis can offer, at least at the moment. They certainly have been for a few years. But the idea is that there were a lot of bad impacts of that, obviously related to the medallion implosion and the pain that taxi drivers suffered, taxi medallion owners suffered. And as new technology comes in, as electric vehicles enter the market, at some point as autonomous vehicles enter the market, cities are going to need to manage that. They're going to need to make sure cities that these new technologies don't overrun the cities, that they're managed in an efficient way, and that they serve the city's goals as well. There are transit deserts in the 5 boroughs. There are places that are just not well served by public transportation. And if you can have a well-functioning transportation system that addresses that, that's a major civic goal. And the idea that using a licensed, highly regulated form of transportation like taxis could potentially play a role in that was something that interested Bradley very much. So Bradley became an investor in Wapanda. That was interesting to me, so I joined the guys. After passing on the investment for a couple of years, I joined the company. So, so that's where I am right now, and we're in the process of having strategic conversations with operators and figuring out ways to potentially get medallions into the next era and bring taxis back to be more competitive and be a more positive contributor to the transportation system here in New York City. Now, NFTs. I want to just digress for a minute and tell you a story about an NFT that has had a really good week. So this is an NFT that, first of all, it's associated with a very memorable physical object with a very memorable and iconic design kit. It has an interesting kind of yellow color associated with it. It also has a revenue stream associated with it. This NFT, if you have this NFT, you can lease that out. You can earn revenue related to that. You can do it for a long period of time. You can do it for a short period of time. And on top of everything else, last Thursday, the owners of this NFT found out the news that the city of New York was actually going to be directing a very important channel to consumers to their product who had not accessed their product before, at least not directly. And it's not a small segment of the consumer market. This is one of the biggest consumer success stories of the last 10 years. So this NFT is a New York City taxi medallion. Now, okay, it's not actually an NFT, but it could be an NFT. And the fact that all these properties could be associated with a digital asset like an NFT, just like the Bored Ape Yacht Club, or just like any piece of art, or any other physical asset that might have some value for some reason to it. If you could digitize the medallion, there are potentially a lot of things you can do with that. You could make that medallion smart and have it do a number of different functions. Now right now, I don't know if anybody actually knows what a medallion looks like or has seen a medallion, but medallions are dumb hunks of metal that are welded onto the back of a taxi. And literally, if you're a lender and you're trying to repossess a medallion that somebody hasn't paid their interest rate on, hasn't paid their lease rate on, you go out, your process of doing repo is to get a crowbar and go to the taxi and pry it off the back of the taxi. So medallions right now are kind of the opposite of a digital asset. They're as physical as they can possibly be. But if you think a little bit about what happens if we actually have something that is associated with a taxi, that can collect, can store, and can transmit data about the taxi, that can potentially tell regulators, is this a valid medallion? Does this taxi have the right insurance? Is the taxi been inspected? If there are sensors related to it, is this taxi in clean condition? Is it in healthy condition? Is the driver smoking? Are there other issues with the taxi that might make this an uncomfortable ride? That might be a reason to potentially to penalize or maybe take the taxi off the road if it's not fulfilling its obligation to provide passengers the ride that they've signed on for and that the city's more or less offered. The city can then start protecting the medallion brand and start making taxis more competitive with Uber and Lyft and with other forms of transportation. They can start using the data to route the taxis in a more efficient way and send them to places where the rides are needed. They can send them away from areas that are congested. They can manage the overall taxi system better by having data that's associated with that right now. Now, there's also the fact that I mentioned a second ago that there's a new value that's attributable to medallions because of Uber allowing medallions or allowing taxis to be booked through the Uber app. That's clearly a value created for medallions, and that ought to increase the price of medallions. And I would say I'm pretty confident the price of medallions has gone up since last Thursday, but honestly, I couldn't tell you that for sure because it takes 30 days for the Taxi Limousine Commission in New York City to report price transactions of medallions. So this is hardly an instantaneous market. This is not the kind of digital market that you would see on the blockchain. Now, if you can turn medallions, another facet of medallions, if you can turn them into financial assets, you can begin transacting much more efficiently. You can begin showing people some reference prices for what medallions should cost and have some sense about where the best buyers and sellers of medallions are. The city can start managing the supply of medallions in a more efficient way. It can think about the financing value of medallions, because the city effectively creates medallions now. That could change in the future if we change the protocol around medallions. This is something that is potentially under discussion as we think about sort of the next phase of the medallion world. But there are a lot of different powers that the city can begin benefiting from if it thinks about these medallions as a digital asset and as a financial asset that it can use. And ultimately, if you think about sort of what the promise of having a real blockchain protocol behind the medallion system could be, there's an opportunity to create the kind of creativity or spawn the kind of creativity in the transportation world that you see in other areas of commerce. You could begin to, if there's a protocol that accommodates the creativity of innovators and allows them to develop new products and new forms of transportation or new connected packages of transportation on their own. There can be taxis of all kinds, of all forms. There can be combinations of taxis with other modes of transportation. There can be other forms of commerce that are associated with a taxi ride. For some reason, you could have loyalty points associated with taxis. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but you could do it. It could be another version of a taxi brand. So there's a canvas that you could paint on that's very broad, and it's consistent with the power of the blockchain and the power of digital assets that could potentially transform the transportation business. And we know what some of the value that the blockchain can bring to new businesses is. We know that the value of having trustless transactions and decentralization can be valuable. We know that has downsides as well. But the conversation, I think, is just beginning now about how can we apply the blockchain and some of these novel protocols like Algorand to new businesses and businesses that might not have been sort of considered eligible for that sort of technology before. So the opportunity is pretty big. I would say, I'd close it off here by saying, first of all, I think the early experimentation on this probably needs to happen in a fairly narrow way. It's probably not going to be a citywide initiative or a broad geographical initiative. I think the experimentation will probably happen with a couple forward-thinking operators who are trying to create maybe a closed system that develops some of the potential of the blockchain and use that as a pilot for potentially larger expansion later. So, the grand sweep, we got to kind of keep our mind, we got to keep our eye on the prize of a really powerful taxi system, transportation system that can serve a lot of goals. But in the short run, the experimentation is probably going to be more modest. And then I would say the other key point I think about all this is, while we need to have ambition about this, and while we need to be very creative in the long run, and we need to realize we have big problems to solve here, and we want to bring out all the resources that we can to solve them. At the end of the day, the people that are driving taxis and most of the people who are riding in taxis or Ubers or Lyfts are not computer scientists. They're not technology innovators. Complexity is not their friend. And we don't want people to have to sit in, when they hop into a taxi and try and figure out what fare they're gonna pay. We don't want to have them thinking about currency pairs between two different tokens. That's not going to be what they're going to do. It's got to be simple. It's got to be user friendly, and at the same time, it's got to be transparent enough that they can be confident that it's fair. And sometimes user friendliness, a nice surface, an easy surface is kind of at odds with transparency. So that's another set of problems that I think we're going to have to work through if we get there. But I think the promise of heading in that direction is great, and I'm excited about where this can potentially go. So love to hear all your responses to this, and to the extent I have answers, I'd love to answer questions.
That sounds unbelievable. Can you use a little more of a snapshot? Like, what are you doing right now?
Yeah, what we're doing right now is we're working with the main part of our business right now is working with existing taxi operators to figure out, all right, how do we sort of use their medallions that are in place now, work with the city to coordinate the city's goals, assign the rights to medallions in a correct way that makes sense. I mean, there are a number of different initiatives that are going on. The one that's gone on that's kind of come to the fore at the moment is this reconciliation of medallion-backed debt, which is sort of getting the drivers out of hock, more or less. And so that's a critical issue. That's a traditional financial services, debt markets workout process.
So the Web3 thing is still kind of an
It's
idea.
it's still an idea.
Okay.
I think the short term idea of let's figure out how to improve there are some very fundamental data problems with the overall taxi system and certainly within the TLC. And we got to resolve those, but I think resolving those with an eye toward what using cutting edge technology could potentially bring us is important.
One of the things that this brings up is Tom was just talking about kind of existing financial technology that exists in the medallion world. As you start to NFT medallions and NFTs in general, and you're reading more about this every day, and it's starting to occur, I think there's about 100 million of available lending, if you will, against NFTs currently. But that is going to be a growing and growing and growing business as time continues to go on. This will approach billions of dollars probably by the end of this year. So the functionality of creating more value around medallions, especially ones that are, one of the problems you've always had with medallions is, as Tom says, there are these metal plates that are sitting, I think they're actually on the hoods of the cars, not the rear of the cars, but maybe they're on both. But it's, people have always said, well, okay, it's great that it's backed by those things, but how do I collect them? Like, what do I do if I have to take delivery of these suckers? Well, if what was being measured here was an NFT, which is by definition so much easier to actually transfer, I'm using quotes there, air quotes, on purpose. It's the same functionality that NFTs are now starting to experience as another tool in the DeFi universe, where lending and borrowing finance is applicable to NFTs. It will spill right over into an industry like the medallion industry and bring incredible amounts of financial efficiency to it. When you get financial efficiency there, that drives value down to the operators as well, to the cities that are backing this as well. And so you start to see how all the problems that are existing start to have bits and pieces of solutions because of some of the power that blockchain is bringing to these types of asset classes.
Thank you guys so much. Very informative. We're going to take questions now, so if anyone has questions, let us know. We have a question already.
So, this is going to be a weird one. I work with the city as a professional engineer all the time, and they have a history of adopting really piss poor management software, right? They don't update it, they don't keep it running. In fact, if you use Microsoft Silverlight, I recently had to upload a document that had to use a virtual machine just to get Silverlight because it's not supported by Microsoft anymore, just to upload a file, to certify a occupancy of a building, right? So if you're going to build a system of digitizing medallions, right, who's going to upkeep it? Is it going to be something that you hand off to the city at some point and they manage it, or is it going to be outsourced?
Great question. I mean, that's...
Did everybody hear the question? It's basically cities historically are great about adopting technology, at least for the first week. And then by week number 2, there's nobody left in their offices when they realize they don't get paid to keep it updated. So they, they're off at the coffee machine. And so who's going to keep an eye on the prize?
So the two potential kind of weapons we have to fight that problem, I think, are, as I mentioned, starting off by piloting this in the private sector. Find an operator who has has a big enough operation that they can begin to identify some of the same problems at a micro level. If they have sort of a microcosm of what running a citywide taxi system is, and they can use digital assets and data collection techniques and collection and transmission techniques to begin to monitor their own system. And then at some point, if they've kind of proven the concept, then that's something the city can look at and say, well, is there a version of this we can adopt? Now, if it goes through the traditional technology purchase process that you described, it sounds like we're probably dead of the water at that point. But that does actually speak for, is there a possibility of using an open system that's trustless, where the city has a role to play but isn't necessarily a gatekeeper in it. I don't know how exactly that's going to work. There are a lot of these things in the blockchain world cut both ways, whether it's open versus closed, or whether it's immutable versus mutable. I mean, those are all these things. The immutability kind of scares me a lot, like especially if you're talking about I want to be, if I'm in the government, I want to be able to repeal bad laws, so like, I want to be able to repeal bad software code too, but, yeah.
So let me try to add a little bit to that, because you started to hit, step on some things. You said earlier in your comments, Tom, that for the operator of a taxi as well as the passengers in it, you got to keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
Or else people aren't going to use it, or they're going to be afraid to use it. That actually is the same story for, I think, the people that are in the procurement side of the technology and running it if you're in the governmental side of it. And I think that's one thing blockchain's actually done a fairly good job of trying to do is there is the folks who are developers, but when you step away from that, all the UI and the UXs that are being created around this stuff are tended to try and be pretty user-friendly. That's one. The second is this, you mentioned, or started to talk about this, hinted around, is the idea of there's no reason why theoretically this couldn't become some form of a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization that self-polices itself essentially with the technology, as long as it operates within some type of governmental compliancy and regulatory standards. So that is one of the beautiful things about decentralized finance and decentralized computing systems in general, is that the systems themselves are their own source of truth. And so that's another means by which we don't necessarily have to just focus on the one guy who's supposed to be operating it for the organization. Other questions? Didi?
Can you talk about the governance structure of Algorand? Because obviously it came out of MIT, so does MIT has a claim on how the protocol gets developed? Just to kind of get a sense.
Yep, sure. It's a very fair question, and it's important, I think, when you look across different blockchain protocols, is to understand that. Now, to understand it for different reasons. To understand it if you're a developer, or to understand it if you're an investor, or to understand it if you're a user. Not everybody has the same cares or wants around those things. With respect to Algorand, as I mentioned, it was built out of Silvio's mind, and it was always built from the floor up on this concept of being decentralized. If you look at where Algorand has been historically, there's the Algorand Inc. and the Algorand Foundation. Primarily, the foundation is where all the tokenomics around the algo, which is the native coinage of Algorand blockchain, is housed. So think of that like Bitcoin, the actual coin, if there was a real actual coin. And you all know there isn't really a coin, right? Just to be clear. It's metaphysical. Same thing with Algorand. So the foundation is responsible for all the tokenomics, all the governance around it. Algorand Inc., the company that I essentially work for, is the technology arm of Algorand. It has nothing to do with it. It's actually gone even further now, where the governance around Algorand, which had been controlled at the foundation as of 6 months ago, has now created a reward system such that anyone who has an algo can be a governor. And I should have mentioned before that any person who has even one algo is a potential validator on the Algorand system. And that's why there's so many potential places where validation can occur vis-a-vis the decentralization argument that we were talking about earlier. Because of the way this new governance has occurred, you can think of Algorand to some degree as creating its own DAO, effectively. That it has become a DAO because the people that own the algos are making the decisions for what the protocol will look like tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. It's not because Silvio says this or Barry says it or Steve says it. It's because the community says it. That's what ultimately decides the next direction that the protocol takes at any given time. And you'll see more and more efforts to try and it's not about putting the power back in the hands, the power's there. It's getting more people to want to be part of the decision-making process. Every person in this room, if they had one algo, could be part of that, but you may not all opt into being part of it, but we want you all to opt into it. So the way the reward system is set up and other incentives will continue to be built accordingly from that perspective. So the fact that there's early educational entities that were backers of the protocol, they have no more say in what happens than you would, Didi, because you own 10 algos. grab that one first, then we'll come back to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I've been a fan of the Algorand blockchain for a while. First bought into it in like October 2020. One of the first things that interested me was the speed of Algorand. Like, so much faster than Visa. That was like sort of the big sort of pitch for the blockchain. I know that it was something you guys are trying to scale up. Just sort of curious, like where you guys are now in terms of the speed of the blockchain and sort of what your outlook is for the
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, and I apologize for those of you who are fans of some of the other protocols. It's hard to explain what the numbers look like without making a comparison. So, the question was, he's been a big fan of Algorand for a long time, and was really impressed by the speed of it, was wanting to know what our plans were for the future in terms of speed and functionality. So, there's a few different measurements of what's important from an efficiency perspective of transaction speed. One is actual transactions per second. And again, as I mentioned during my original soliloquy here, was a transaction does not mean just sending something to a node. It means having that round trip finalize. That's a transaction, at least in the Algorand way of describing what a transaction is. And secondly is how many blocks can be propagated and how quickly they can be propagated. And for those of you who don't understand, you get a group of transactions together and then that forms a block, and then the next group of transactions will be put together and form the next block, and so on and so on and so forth. And it's only as powerful as your ability to propagate those blocks and have them being final, verified, and move on to the next block. Because if you're not doing that, then you're just creating a weak chain. So, Algorand currently runs at 1,200 transactions per second. By way of comparison, Ethereum would be around 15 transactions per second. Bitcoin would be about 7 transactions per second. There are other protocols which will claim numbers that are equivalent or even far greater. I can tell you that none of them are on an actual mainnet. None of them are talking about finalized round-trip transactions. So again, won't talk badly about them, just do your homework as you look into those, and if you're developers or builders, make sure you understand what that all means. As far as block propagation is concerned, we currently do sub 4.5 seconds per block. By the way, all this information you can see in real time on the Algorand website. You can look it up and it'll show the metrics. You can literally watch it day by day by day. And roughly speaking, there's about 2 million transactions per day that occur on Algorand. That's significantly greater than anybody else, other than those who are just getting transaction volume from people buying and selling their native coin. Those are like real transactions happening, just to give you an idea, like real things occurring, like real world things happening. As far as where it's going to go to, Silvio announced at the end of last year that we would be upgrading to 10,000 transactions per second, very quick, like that's going to happen within weeks. The only reason we haven't moved it to that already, we could do it right now, is simply because there isn't really a call for it. I mean, we rarely have a day where we have transactions per second exceeding like 20. To be perfectly honest with you, we'd love it if it was, but it hasn't happened. So we could do it tomorrow if we wanted to. The real goal is to move it to 50,000 transactions per second, which that will happen at the same time that we reduce the block propagation to sub 2.5 seconds. And just to create speed for speed's sake, but do anything else that would create a diminution of the protocol service would be foolhardy. And so we wouldn't do that. We also take it very strongly that we don't make outlandish claims and then don't meet them. Every system upgrade and protocol upgrade that we've made was identified beforehand and met as expected within the time frame that was put forth. So that's the answer to the numbers. To give you an idea of speed and cost, which you might find really fascinating, this is a great story, and it's a very true story. It's not a propaganda story. Late last year, CI, which is the Italian Rights Music Organization, they have 100,000 different artists that are part of their organization. It's a 140-year-old organization. They handle all the royalty streams for all the artists. There's about 40 odd different streams per artist where they get royalty rights from. CI took each and every one of those streams for each and every one of their artists, a total of 4.2 million different individual identities, if you will, and tokenized every single one of them. They made 4.2 million NFTs. They did them all in Algorand. They did them all within about a 5-hour period of time. That's how efficient and quickly you can create a token. All the native tools necessary for tokenizing something can be done at layer 1 on Algorand. All your risk-based controls are right there at layer 1. You don't have to write multiple smart contracts and different ERC 721s and ERC 20s and ERC 1151s, whatever the heck they are, for each one of those steps. They're all right there natively at layer 1. So it was all able to be done in 5 hours. It would have taken months to do it on ETH as an example. More importantly is the cost for 4.2 million transactions on that day would have cost, depending on what time you clipped doing that over that period of time, somewhere between $250 and $450 million to do that. It cost under $10,000 to do it on Algorand. That's the magnitude that we're talking about here, people. It's significant. It is significant. And the reason for that was the gas fees. The gas fees were a measurement of the electrical output that was being required under Ethereum. So there's a reason why ETH is going to switch over to ETH 2.0. This is a big one, a big reason for it. There's one here first, I think.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about the developer community and some innovations happening on Algorand on the app side. Things that are growing there. Is it just people forking other projects from other chains, or are there kind of new ideas coming on?
Yeah, so fair question, great question. So as I mentioned, Algorand is sort of a little bit ahead of the game because of its enterprise capabilities. So large banking, large insurance, large governmental enterprise level world-class institutions are currently building on or experimenting with different type of builds out on Algorand. The developer community is incredibly robust. There's, I don't know, 20, 25 different NFT marketplaces. There's sort of like one or two new one that gets either announced or built every day. We can't, in business development, we used to be able to be responsible for each and every project that was being built, each dApp, if you will. We can't. We just don't even try anymore. It's just not possible. So we have actually created what we call the Algorand ecosystem. Oh my God, I'm just having a small brain fog moment there. Must be the COVID kicking in. Directory, the ecosystem directory, so that the community itself is now maintaining a directory of all the different projects that are either already existing or being built on it, so that you can go there and essentially filter and say NFTs, DeFi, pick your favorite filter and see the 10s and the 20s and the 30 different projects that are building on there. Now, with that said, in fairness, there's 10x or even 100x number of developers that are building on places like Ethereum. It's been around for a hell of a lot longer. There's no question about it. There's nothing, we're not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. But with every day, that's changing. One of the other reasons that that's starting to change is because it wouldn't be lost on most of the crowd, I suppose, the term interoperability, an overused and not often understood term, but basically the ability for chains to talk amongst one another. Let's just call it that for the simplistic state. And that is a really tough problem to solve. And people want to solve that problem for obvious reasons. We've historically been able to solve it. We can do it. I'm going to use a term that I don't even understand what it means, but I know that it works, which is hash time locks. The problem with using that is you're subject to the lowest common denominator, if you will, i.e. we could support Ethereum transactions on Algorand and be interoperable, but we would be taking all of Algorand's strengths and bringing it to the Ethereum level. That kind of defeats the purpose. With the establishment of state proofs, again, a technical term, which I will happily point any of you technocrats to the people who will understand that better at our shop, we now have the ability to support Ethereum projects on Algorand without crushing the powers that are Algorand, if you will. So you still get all the benefits of Algorand, but you're able to operate Ethereum. Now, with that said, it is sort of in beta mode at this mode. It was launched about a month ago, 3 weeks ago, and it will be functional in weeks to come. But that's big. And then from state proofs of Ethereum, we'll move to state proofs of other chains and all, and go from there for that reason. Types of projects stretch from your standard NFTs, your standard DeFi, working with CBDCs. We're on 14, 15 different CBDC projects. Currently, we're working with banks all around the world, bringing digital assets online, huge mortgage-backed security type of products, equity launches. We have 3 different ETF equivalents. A S&P index fund just launched that's through Securitize. It's based on written on Algorand. There's a second one that's forthcoming that was just filed with the SEC this week, I believe. We have multiple projects that are in the ESG space, Planet Watch, Climate Trade, to name a couple.
Not the most innovative groups, though, those big institutions.
No, but they're the ones that are going to change the way the world thinks about blockchain. I mean, for all the great Bored Apes in the world, I mean, it's lovely and it's wonderful, but that's cool, but that's not going to make a damn bit of difference when it comes to moving trillions and trillions of dollars across borders and being able to have people in Somalia be able to afford rice because there's other people in around the world that can easily. I mean, the idea is to bank the unbanked at the end of the day. So it's all a matter of what you're trying to achieve, but we're not forgetting the people that want to do all the cool transactions either. That's why there's so many different applications now building Airist, AB2 Gallery, Artery, all these gamifications that are occurring, metaverse stuff, just blowing out all over the place. There's $4.5 billion of Algorand venture capital money that has been raised that invests specifically in projects that are designed and built on Algorand, and that's away from other venture capital money that stands ready to invest in Algorand projects. It's just not dedicated Algorand money. And again, the reason is because people make the assumption, hopefully rightly, not wrongly, that if built on Algorand, it's got a very high likelihood of succeeding, at least at the technical level. The idea might be for shit. I can't, who knows? But at least it won't be because the base technology is falling down around it. Was there a question in the middle there? Okay. Can we just take one more question there?
Yeah, thank you. Could you give us a rough breakdown of what the activity is in Algorand? Is it more DeFi, NFT, payments? What are the growth areas you're seeing? What are you most excited about in the future?
So excitement is probably around the DeFi and the NFT stuff, just because there's so much that's happening. Now, with that said, we're always going to have an eye on the whole payment side of the world, because as I was just mentioning to this gentleman here, again, you can have all the NFTs you want happening. And when I'm talking about NFTs, I'm talking about the kind of like the Bored Ape sort of NFTs that are kind of cool and sexy, and fun to play with it all. I'm not talking about the NFTs that we're talking about here. To me, that's high finance. Again, you can apply that to payments. Ultimately, it's payments, but blockchain is so, powerful and we're starting to get closer and closer to that becoming the reality that we all know that it can be. Digital assets online, I expect that this year that will become such a piece of commonplace terminology that it'll become colloquial, as you see, and it's happening. Over the next weeks and months, you'll see many massive digital assets launched on chain, not just through us, but through others. Major bond deals, IPOs, and the like that are now being done digitally. There's a number of countries. You see what's happening with El Salvador, with Colombia, and so forth, that are using blockchain as a means by which to efficiently raise capital for their own country debt and all. So these are all things that are happening, and they're happening with regularity now on chain, at least through Algorand. So did you want to?
Yeah, we're gonna wrap it up, but we're gonna meet back at the bar area. So if you guys have more questions, I'm sure that Barry will be available to do that. We thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks to Rivka. Thanks to D.